good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are in the world. On behalf of the Teaching International Law Interest Group of the American Society of International Law, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this session by Professor Rohini Sen. Rohini would be speaking on TWAIL and feminism. Without further ado, I would invite Rohini to present her paper. Rohini, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rizwan. I will quickly share my screen. I have an illustrative PowerPoint to go with some of what I will have to say. I will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then perhaps we can open the conversation up to questions from you and from whoever has been kind enough to attend today. Are you able to see my screen? Great. So I've titled this presentation, The Teaching of TWAIL Feminisms and TWAIL Feminisms. There is a reason the hyphen is there in place, as you can see. It's called the Politics and Pedagogy of Hyphens, and I will come to that shortly. This is a work in progress. It's also part of a larger feminist TWAIL collective that some of us have been building with threefold objective. One is to center certain kinds of TWAIL feminist work as integral to international law, both its teaching and research. Two is to bring to focus the interventions and the contributions of TWAIL feminist work that have bolstered international law, but has not received the same kind of acknowledgement. And the third is to contribute to ongoing conversations on search for different epistemological premises for doing international law. So I want to open with something. This is also a working paper. It's a working draft, but I want to open with something that foregrounds the primary claim of TWAIL feminist positions. So as you can see on this slide, TWAIL and feminisms, particularly TWAIL feminisms, these are epistemological critiques, sensibilities and approaches which bring the realities of international law in sharp focus. As bodies of theory on power, they serve three important functions: to articulate hierarchies and realities that affect every subject of international law, however differentially; to provincialize patriarchy and Eurocentrism as manifestations of a social majority and not as universal experiences; and to open us up to different ways of looking at the world. I start with this because this is pretty much at the core of the research and teaching project of TWAIL feminist ethos or approaches. We call these sensibilities and approaches because beyond the theory grounding that they do, these are also dispositions that one cultivates. These are certain kinds of ethical practices and ethical moorings that one acquires over time. And the most substantive intervention that it's looking to make is to rehabilitate the idea that these sort of things are only to be done by those who are experientially in the position of a certain kind of oppression. So we say it's a structural critique. What that means is it has something important to say about the structure of international law as it is and as it could be. So these are definitely not vantages where one has to be specifically oppressed or located a certain way. While that is true, it's a much larger project than that, and that's why we call it an epistemological and a structural critique. The second bit, which is to provincialize patriarchy and Eurocentrism, sort of follows logically from the first one. If this is a position or a vantage that gives us some insight into different kinds of world making, then so is the existing premise. What we know of contemporary international law to be, this is not a universal project, even though it is presented as a universalist project. That's also a position, that's also a vantage, and it needs to be provincialized. And the third idea is to understand how there are other ways and different ways of looking at the world. So this is sort of where the project stands, both in terms of research and teaching. What is the relevance of the epistemological assertion that I make at the opening slide? One is asking the oppressed question. I think very often with critical apparatus like TWAIL and feminism, there's a charge that this is colony speaking to hegemony, and there are only specific questions it asks around certain realms of oppression. So the primary idea is to go beyond this. These are not simply questions to be asked of oppressed marginality. These are questions to be positioned or posed as universal potential of international law. In other words, the universalization of international law cannot just be left to the center or the mainstream, but it has to come from the margins as well. And the center-margin relationship is a lot more complicated than what we know it to be. The second significant reason for asking this question is what we understand to be epistemological ignorance. Now, epistemological ignorance is not simply a knowledge gap or blankness that exists in terms of the information that one has to secure about marginal positions. Sometimes it is an intentionally cultivated sense of ignorance. Sometimes it's just the default. I'll come to how this manifests in the teaching and research of international law, particularly the teaching of it in Global South locations. But by and large, it's not having to ask or account for certain kind of positions that take on universal nature. So in other words, this creation of universality emerges from a particular position, but epistemological ignorance then erases that particular positionality. So it serves two purposes. One, it does not make the hegemonic structure self-reflexive. And two, it does not require the hegemony to know much about marginality other than what is of interest to it. And to push against this sort of epistemological ignorance, a TWAIL feminist apparatus becomes particularly handy in doing so. And the third is the idea that margins actually offer better conceptualization. On one hand, we understand education and the domain of education, knowledge making, knowledge building to clearly be a space of distinct privilege. You have to have certain socioeconomic currency, certain political inclination, and to be able to partake in the elite language that English is in many education institutions, to be able to, acquire education in that sense. But this idea also tells you that margins offer better conceptualization, whereas mainstream offers a certain illusory understanding of things. What that simply means is experiencing the world and experiencing the international legal apparatus from a particular position of oppression and marginality actually gives you a closer sense of the reality of its systems and operations. And therefore, margins are not simply locations of oppression, but they're actually very pertinent and potent sites of world building and world making. And this is the kind of idea that TWAIL feminist thought wants to center. I wanted to talk a little bit about the difficulties of writing about and teaching TWAIL feminisms. As you could see from the two earlier slides, very often it appears that we are working with a certain sense of abstraction as to what this is, and this is not entirely untrue. So the reason I want to articulate the difficulties in the beginning is so that when I introduce the apparatus later on, you're able to follow along with me and perhaps share some of those difficulties. So the first set of difficulties I call conceptual difficulties of being and of doing. And there are two conceptual difficulties that I've had to work with when I was trying to figure out how to write about TWAIL feminisms, how to think about TWAIL feminism. The first was the question of being. So in contemplating what being a feminist, among other things, mean, the impulse has always been to come back to a particularly agonizing meditation by Leela Abulugod, which is, while there indeed may be something different in the process of women writing about women for women, there may not be anything inherently feminist left to work with when woman as a category is made to collapse. So if the feminist project, among many things, also looks to interrogate this essentialization, this sort of ontology, this kind of category, at some point, the category will collapse. And in that moment, what does being a feminist mean? However, collapsing this category is a very crucial feminist process. Similarly, if being TWAIL or if being TWAILian is to think of and think with the third world, then the gradual diffusion and assimilation of the third world into the first world, and I obviously use these terms with the charge and the valence that they carry. So this gradual assimilation into something new will also extinguish the TWAIL project. So if critical projects indeed come with a certain kind of relationship as between the center and periphery, and either at one point look to assimilate into the center or to disintegrate the center, then they themselves cease to exist. So this was a conceptual difficulty of being that I experienced while writing this, while reckoning or perhaps accounting with the fact that maybe that is what critical projects do. At some point, they cease to exist, and that's how we measure the success of critical projects. So these are both contingent and partial identities. And each of them individually and together, they require a critique of essentializing and false universalities. They require a certain kind of disruption of the mainstream while acknowledging that they are entangled into the mainstream. And they require embracing a particular mode of fluidity and diversity of views and identities. But if you are each of these things together, this is a very paradoxical transfiguration. So being something also propels the metamorphosis to, at some point, cease being the very thing. The second conceptual difficulty that I encountered was the idea of what does doing feminism mean? And as someone who largely identifies as a TWAIL feminist scholar, teacher, critical researcher, one primary challenge has been to distinguish between the various ways of doing feminism, be it transnational, be it post-colonial, be it decolonial, and third world feminisms, to name a few. I call this a conceptual difficulty because I think we actually may have outlived our need and use for some of these categories as distinct ways of doing things. Not only do they take off from each other, they bleed into each other, and we often inhabit multiple identities and multiple positions at the same time. So while there is value in analyzing them separately, I'm not sure the value remains in doing them as separate modes of feminism at this point. The other kind of difficulty that I encountered was mostly an existential difficulty, which is the different positions that I inhabit depending on who my primary audience is. In a location that is not necessarily the global south, I am in some instances forced to represent global south in a way I may not necessarily be equipped to do. Whereas in different global south locations, a certain kind of privilege that I possess of a particular socioeconomic bracket that I inhabit, the fact that I'm able to speak English in a particular way, which also speaks to my caste identity and my class identity, that is what gets foregrounded in those instances. So the existential question becomes, am I the right person to talk about this project? In some places, yes. In other places, perhaps not. But that's a question that sort of continues to remain and continues to be debated and engaged with, even as we formulate a TWAIL feminist perspective of research and teaching. The reason I wanted to talk about these difficulties, both conceptual and existential, is the act of teaching is a difficult conduct. It comes with certain ideas and ethos that we must cultivate, we must nurture, and we must practice. And while we talk about practical exigencies of teaching, things such as course manual, things such as navigating a classroom, I think it's important to also account for the self-reflexive difficulties that we encounter. Because any sort of critical apparatus, especially a TWAIL feminist one, because it looks to dislodge things, it also doesn't necessarily believe in a canonical approach. And therefore, foregrounding some of these, I think, is important, because I suspect this will be a common set of struggle that most people working with critical apparatuses that look to alternate epistemologies end up encountering. So, TWAIL feminism is something I call a theory of crisis. And it's located at the intersection of three modes of crisis. The first I call the crisis of the discipline of international law itself. What this simply means is things that were taken as given or taken for granted in international law, both on account of their seeming universality and solidity, no longer exist that way. Some will say there are disciplinary turns that international law is taking. Others will say it's at the risk of fragmentation. I understand this as a crisis of internalizing certain kinds of critique, which cracks open the seeming solidity of international law and the universalism and allows certain ideas to emerge through those cracks. One of which being foregrounding TWAIL feminism as a certain central idea to the making of international law. The second crisis is the mobilization of a particular kind of sexual panic, sexual violence crisis by dominant feminism. This is best illustrated when we look at initiatives such as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda by the United Nations. On one hand, they've obviously clearly served certain kinds of beneficial interventionist purposes and projects. On the other hand, what it has done is it's co-opted the critical thrust of the different forms of critical feminist projects that were looking to make structural critiques to begin with. In other words, this excessive focus on sexual violence as the primary kind of harm that women experience, and therefore the appropriate response to it being a certain kind of securitization, has taken attention away from all the other ways in which we could do TWAIL feminism and through which TWAIL feminism was looking to reshape international law. So anti-war feminism, decolonial feminist thought, looking at feminist perspectives on land, on territoriality, all of them have taken a backseat on account of this sort of crisis mobilization. The third is a crisis of difference. Even as we try to invoke TWAIL feminist perspectives, it becomes difficult not to essentialize or not to be essentialized. The very nomenclature of TWAIL feminism speaks to a certain kind of essentialization. So what I suggest, or what I think of TWAIL feminist apparatus as, is something that is located between these three interrelated intersectional crises. And crisis here is not just a moment of rupture, but it's also a moment of possibility where new things have the potential to emerge and to give international a different kind of character and shape. So let me introduce the TWAIL feminism apparatus very quickly through certain heuristics and techniques. I use three of them. This is again illustrative. There are many others. The first I call against definition. The second I call the politics of hyphen. And the third one I refer to as other epistemologies. So against definition serves two functions. First, it tells us that the very idea of defining something which seems to be very crucial to a positivist legal project forecloses possibilities. So we call this against definition for two reasons. One, it's foreclosing possibilities, and two, both TWAIL and feminism are critical ideas that are typically defined against something. They are also prescriptive projects, but by and large, you will hear TWAIL being oppositional to a certain vision of mainstream, feminism being oppositional to a certain vision of patriarchy. So both of these, despite their immense critical potential, typically tend to be defined against and therefore foreclosed in a certain way. What we want to do with a particular kind of TWAIL feminist ethos is to remember that defining also means foreclosing possibilities and work with a logic that all definitions are political. The act of defining is an act of cutting and an act of erasure. So we work with working definitions, contingent definitions, and we remember that these have typically been defined against. So if we don't want to define them, what do? If we don't want to define them, we move on to what I call the politics of hyphen. Hyphens are indeed political, both in the American sense of nomenclature and in the way we want to use it in this context. And the reason they are political is because sometimes it points to you artificial separations of things that aren't separate but may be analyzed separately. And sometimes it tells you of what one should focus on rather than what one is currently focusing on vis-a-vis international law. So if you're not defining and if you're engaging with the politics of hyphen, there are three sorts of hyphenated integrated relationship between TWAIL and feminism that I potentially propose. The first one is simply TWAIL and feminisms, no hyphen here. And here, the understanding is TWAIL and feminisms are separate apparatus with completely different critical thrust. They're analogous to each other, but they're not necessarily looking at the same thing. The second and third, which are personally of a lot more interest to me and where I think the strength of the TWAIL feminist project lies, is the idea of using TWAIL hyphen feminism as relational or something that integrates, or as TWAIL feminism, in the sense that we're interested in understanding one within the other. So TWAIL hyphen feminism in this instance could mean that we are interested in the relationship between TWAIL and feminism as critical apparatuses that are looking at the same thing or doing something very similarly. They're not necessarily distinct. They are related, and we are interested in the relationship that they have. And they can have numerous relationships. It could be a relationship of productive tension. It could be a relationship where some things are in synergy and others are not. It could be a relationship where within the umbrella of TWAIL, there are a group of feminists who are looking at international law through a TWAIL feminist perspective. It could also be a position where within TWAIL, feminism occupies a certain kind of marginality. So the politics of hyphen then unpacks the various ways in which TWAIL and feminism interact with each other, sometimes productively and sometimes not so much. So if we cease to define, we foreground relationship and relationality. And that takes us to what I understand to be a certain kind of inquiry that we make from other epistemologies. Now, one of the most important way of understanding search for other epistemologies, which is both a long-standing project of TWAIL and feminism, is that one has to be aware of the multiplicity of self and the multiple overlapping and interactive qualities of the other. These are very critical to dispelling any kind of binaries. So while various interventions have been made to reclaim colonial patriarchal structures, the core concern of this mainstream periphery dialogic always remains. In the absence of mainstream, how does one construct the periphery? And this is where I think the TWAIL feminist project at the intersection of various crises is very, very important. So why? Because it translates into a very essential epistemological inquiry. A, what are the characteristics of TWAIL feminism? If you are not defining, if you are foregrounding relationship making, then what really are its characteristics? This question again can be understood in two ways. Is there something inherently feminist and or TWAIL when it is not constrained, when it is not defined against, when it is not devalued? And B, can TWAIL feminism make a difference to the doing of international law and TWAIL? The first question is absolutely inexplicable and perhaps in some ways unanswerable. It goes back to the conceptual difficulty that I was articulating. If critiques come in to displace and dislodge and are not meant to be categories in and of themselves once whatever they dislodge cease to exist, then trying to answer whether certain things are inherently feminist, inherently TWAIL, or inherently feminist TWAIL becomes problematic. So I make my way out of this by not answering the question. The second one, actually, however, allows for a certain kind of structural argument about world making in international law, where the critical positioning of TWAIL feminisms with the hyphen and TWAIL feminisms without the hyphen actually can create important changes. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is both TWAIL and feminisms are practices that show us how we're always a part of what we study and also stand in definite relation to. So this exercise of foregrounding a certain kind of situatedness and partiality of all representations and knowledge can unsettle the boundaries of international law. And in this instance, I think the unsettling the boundary of international law simply means that TWAIL feminism as a praxis, through its various identities, works with an assumption of difference in sameness. And it actually may have the capacity to move beyond the impasse of these various crises that we are now witnessing in the international legal apparatus. So in other words, if it were an international law with TWAIL feminism at the center and written by TWAIL feminists, despite all its unevenness, something would have changed. And the TWAIL feminist project is actually to understand what is the something that changes rather than what are the qualities that we must look for when identifying a TWAIL feminist project. So then I work with what I call two working definitions. TWAIL being a dynamic, open-ended idea and approach, typically tending to the state of global souths, also located in various global norths because global souths and global norths are no longer static, through the working of international law. Feminism is by and large concerned with racial, capitalist, gendered oppressions in various forms, places, and institutions, including institutions such as the family as well as larger institutions of the discipline. So these working definitions then ask us to confront the idea of other epistemologies through the notion of entanglement. If we are going to locate TWAIL feminism in particular context, and I keep saying that, that there's a very specific relationship between mainstream and periphery that we look to explore, the first thing it tells you is this is about centering a messy reality of international law. We're not looking at separate spheres of work. We are looking at a state of great entanglement, which means the TWAIL feminist project, despite and possibly because of its radical potential, accounts for entanglements with nationalist projects, with capitalist projects, with different iterations of modernization, because it is impossible to escape these. This is where we are all located, and this is where we are mounting the critique from. Two, that the idea of identities is not embodied and not static. In the illustration I was giving earlier about my own existential difficulty with this, these identities move, and therefore the critical apparatus and the working definitions also move in context. TWAIL feminisms work and operate with the idea of flattening laws and flattening institutions. What this means is it understands laws as in and of produced through social context and not something transcendental that is looking down upon its subject. And this is where I think the feminist thrust of personal and political becomes substantively important. And the last bit, which is going beyond liberal imagination, is the question we asked earlier, that if international law was to be located at a TWAIL feminist vantage and written by TWAIL feminists, what would have shifted? And we can sense that something would have shifted. So this sensing is the other epistemological inquiry that we make. I'm very quickly going to talk a little bit about what the teaching process is like, and then perhaps, I shall stop and then we can engage with questions if there are any. So this rather abstract apparatus translates into something slightly more tangible when it comes to teaching. The first thing it does is it provincializes knowledge and knowledge making. This is important because every version of knowledge is partial knowledge. And in the discipline of law, particularly international law, we do not see enough of that. So introducing a critical apparatus like TWAIL feminism, which operates on self-reflexivity and partial standing, that framework allows all knowledge to be contingent. So in the classroom, that means very clearly articulating that while there are illustrative frameworks that are dominant, the discipline has no canon. Decanonizing something is difficult because we are not just introducing new content, we're actually expecting a cognitive alteration. And this is where I think the TWAIL feminist understanding that you're not on solid ground and your identity moves sort of helps. So how do we provincialize and contextualize knowledge making in course of the teaching? One, we actively go out and look for different sources that speak to international law, not necessarily from a particular positivist mainstream. This means interrogating the existing texts, introducing more feminist texts, analyzing the various positions and contexts of different authors, their authorial training, their legal training, and then unpacking all of that in the classroom and through the teaching process, which also requires a certain ethics of self-reflexivity. Recognizing that all of us and in all of us inhere a partial understanding of knowledge, that our positions and privileges keep changing, but most importantly, when each of us engage with content, we are produced and altered along with the content itself. This sounds, again, difficult in the context of a discipline that holds on to a certain sense of solidity. That's sort of the crux of any kind of law teaching. You offer definitions and you offer solidity. So to destabilize that through this framework can be very jarring. Which brings me to the idea of didactic discomfort. I think one of the requirements of any kind of TWAIL feminist teaching or pedagogy is to encounter a sense of being uncomfortable. Not necessarily being uncomfortable in a way, oh, I think this is a problematic discussion to have, but being uncomfortable in a way where the way we understand the world slowly shifts over a period of time. So a kind of cognitive dissonance, a kind of cognitive reorientation, where simple binaries of public, private, law, not law, all of these start collapsing very, very slowly at some point. To do this, we pay particular attention to our ways of reading, not just what we read. I call this the praxis of meta reading. We focus on the relationship between different elements and subjects of international law, rather than just reading a content, including our relationship with the discipline itself, and incorporate all of this in the teaching process while recognizing that this is a contingent way, and at some point this will give way to something else. I use all of this in a particular course I teach, which is called Many Faces of International Law, Critiques and Limits, which both looks at a sort of meta-critique of international law and its teaching, as well as teaching through the TWAIL feminist apparatus. I do have the course manual with me today. I was initially thinking of going through bits of it, but I think I will stop at this point and then perhaps specific questions might help unpack this better, because I do realize this is a fairly abstract presentation. So I'm just going to stop now.
Thank you, Rohini, for your excellent presentation. As we hear from the colleagues, their questions, let me ask you the first one. That whenever you were teaching TWAIL or any feminist approach to international law, I guess, and I think you also mentioned it at the beginning of your presentation, that you encountered this question that, are you teaching what international law should be as opposed to how it is practiced? If you do encounter it, I'm assuming you do. If you don't, then it's another way. But if you do, how do you encounter that? How do you respond to that? Thank you.
That's a very helpful question, I think. International law in and of itself, especially in global south locations, experiences a certain kind of distance. In other words, I think people think international law is not done in the global south, which is where the practice aspect comes into the picture. I do get that question, and my response to that usually is there are many ways of doing it. I also see the teaching of international law as a form of praxis, and the university as a certain kind of institution where it is practiced, which in this instance means you're sort of collapsing the theory practice binary. That is something that critical apparatus will do. And in teaching international law this way, you also tell people that this is not a study of international law in theory as against how it is done. This is an articulation of how it really operates. So the institutional life of international law is important, and critique tends to show you how the institutional life of international law works. I think we try to break down this perceived distance between theory and practice by understanding what the institutions of international law are slightly differently. But it's not that students are often satisfied with the answer to that question. So it's sort of a long-standing conversation and journey.
Thank you for that answer. Now, in your paper, I think you quoted Joya Nogales, and you have sort of expressed an aspiration. I'm quoting it for the benefit of our audience. Yeah. That women in international lawmaking and reform should be able to form a theme political alliance based on their shared experience. And if they are successful at including diverse voices, international law will change in a way that cannot be predicted. So I was wondering that if that has to happen, what would be the catalyst to that? And do you see any concerted effort for this? Thank you.
That's a really great question. I would actually say that has already happened in some ways. The mobilization has not necessarily happened around the idea of women forming a loose consolidation, but more around certain feminist thoughts slowly shifting the terrain of international law. So in this same work, I speak a little bit about what has TWAIL feminism done so far, even before it was identified as TWAIL feminism or foregrounded as TWAIL feminism. One of the things it's done is complicate the relationship between the state, individual, territoriality, and bodies. So traditional feminist critique on sexual violence and its relationship with the state stops at the idea that the post-colonial state uses narratives of sexual violence to enhance policing, enhance securitization. TWAIL feminism takes this apparatus and uses it in different ways. One of which is pointing out how mainstream feminism's excessive emphasis on securitization has taken away attention from other concerns that typically become gendered. For instance, feminization of poverty, environmental extraction, destruction of indigenous life, so on and so forth. So TWAIL feminism has already reoriented the gaze towards this. The other is a critique of notions of gender and notions of binary. It starts with the public-private distinction, but goes on further in the works of decolonial feminists to actually critique the idea of gender itself. In other words, even if we are existing in certain forms of binaries or spectrum in a society, they don't always necessarily map onto the idea of gender. So all this to say that there have been substantive, tangible shift, but I think what is interesting is these changes or these ideas remain in the periphery rather than being centrally discussed in the teaching and research of international law. So the question then is, why has it not made its way to mainstream teaching of international law yet, rather than what has it done or not done? I think that's sort of my perspective of where the intervention is and how it is studied, understood, perceived, particularly in the context of teaching.
Thank you. Maybe what I typed in the chat box might have confused some of the colleagues. So you should type in your questions or comments in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of our screen. I'm sorry, I mistakenly wrote that questions can be put in the chat box. So you could put all your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Thank you. Now, that answer, Rohini, from you brings me to my next question, that we are saying that it's an era of human rights, that individuals' rights matter. But whenever we're talking about mainstream international law, I can almost always see a focus on the aim of states, the practice of states, the concern of states. An individual is at best on the periphery or a secondary concern. So what is your view on that? And how could TWAIL or feminist movement or intellectual discourse, whatever you call it, do about this? Thank you.
That's a very big question. I'm going to answer just a part of it because I think there's so much it can do, but the question is then what sort of capacity is it working with? You're right. I mean, the vision of international law is state-centric, and I think most critical apparatus that apprehend international law tend to point that out. And relocating the conversation to individual is something TWAIL has done. We see it in texts such as Everyday Life of TWAIL. Feminist Project has, the long-standing feminist interventions have been about connecting the personal to the political, making a distinction, collapsing the distinction between public and private. So I think in this instance, one thing that I find helpful in the teaching of international law is unpacking the idea of state and unmaking the notion of sovereignty. And this, I think, both TWAIL and feminist approaches do fairly well, at least in the context of teaching. So if you're unpacking the notion of statehood and you understand how a state or how any kind of state projects create liminality and marginality, you're invariably connecting it to a conversation on citizens. So take the example of minority citizenship in post-colonial states, which is a fairly pertinent question. And this sort of unpacking then happens both through TWAIL and through Feminist Project. What constitutes a minority? How is this liminality maintained by the state? What sort of function does law serve in both producing and maintaining this kind of liminality? So I think the analytical thrust that both TWAIL and feminist projects offer really unpack and unmake the state for what it is and how it both operates through the law as well as through various individuals. But I think your question was more about how should we center the individual and rehabilitate international law. That I think is an ongoing conversation, partly by using devices of storytelling within international law of individual locations, individual advantages. There has been some displacement of certain stereotypes, one of which is the Muslim woman and the conceptualization of the Muslim woman in the international law narrative. So a series of veil ban cases and the critical response to them were actually able to complicate individual identities and positions in the sense that it offers a wider array to think of the relationship between the individual and the state. One is, how is the state defining these individuals, not just in relationship to themselves, but also as culturally produced artifact. And once we get a sense of how that is happening, we are then able to counter those narratives, center the individual accounts in different ways, and sometimes even imagine law from the vantage of different groups of individuals, or different, imaginations of law itself. So it's a difficult thing to do, but I think this is something that both TWAIL and feminist approaches have been engaged with for a long time. And the reason we are able to have this conversation is partly because it's been able to mainstream itself in a helpful way, I think.
Thank you for the answer. Yeah, really, that was a tough question, and a question that in itself deserves a webinar like this. Next question is from a participant, an anonymous attendee. She or he asks, what sorts of alternative texts do you use in the teaching? Do you think there is value in using fictional texts, novels, short stories, poems, etc., written by feminists as an example of alternative texts in teaching international law? I think you refer to Begum Rokea's text in your chapter. So I do not know how you teach. Of course, I had the privilege of reading your course outline, but I don't know how you teach it. So that's the next question to you. Thank you.
This is actually a really great question. I particularly enjoy questions like this because it allows us to do two things. One, complicate the idea of law and not law. The law determines its own limits. As in, when we make the distinction between this is a legal text and this is not, we are in some ways determining what boundaries of a legal text are. So this, particularly the introduction of certain literary texts, really allows us to complicate the concept of law itself. And the answer to this is yes, I do. I genuinely enjoy introducing different literary traditions to understand international law better. And one, as Rizwan said, is Rokeya Hossain's Sultana's Dream. I particularly enjoy that text because of the time of its writing, the context it comes from, and it very much is a piece of feminist science fiction. And if you are actually to look at some of the earlier feminist movements, including activism around the ILO, labor standards, labor rights, there are texts that refer to a feminist utopia that's almost comparable to what Rokeya Hossain is saying, in colonial India. So not only is it an alternate constructive imagination, it's also a useful conversation to have, both in terms of the limits of law and the limits of lawmaking. So that's one text I use largely to construct a feminist utopia and to go back to legal traditions and see whether they've imagined similar feminist utopias. The other text that I use is Mahashweta Devi's play, Draupadi, and the foreword written by Spivak on the text and how she unpacks it. This text actually serves as a great critical discourse on statehood, state-making, post-colonial state, and the body of the woman as a site of violence. But we also use the foreword of the text to identify different characters in the text as approximation of the third world scholar, the first world scholar, and the third world interlocutor. So yes, I mean, I definitely cross-purpose literature with international law because I just think it allows for a sharper understanding and unpacking of the law itself. I'm happy to share the course manual, which actually has some of these course details and how they are used in the context of particular themes and topics of international law. I don't know how I'm going to share that with the attendees, but Rizwan, you have a copy, so.
Yes, thank you for that answer. If any of the colleagues would be emailing us, maybe we could share it with them. I'll type in my email address here and also your email address if that is okay with you. The next question that I would like to put to you is, you actually made this point in your presentation that liberal feminism is often putting an excessive focus on sexual violence, and that, in your view, is undermining some other prospects of feminist movement of feminism. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that, more on that? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. So this is actually a very substantive critique that, again, TWAIL feminists have made, and so have others, that what is understood to be the primary, first of all, there is an excessive focus on feminist theories should only tend to women's problems. The vision was something completely different. The idea was if contemporary mainstream international law is a certain kind of vantage that was universalized, then everything else is also a vantage that has the potential of being universalized. And if that is the project, then there are structural changes that we should be in a position to make. What it ended up becoming was focusing on what is understood to be the most challenging dimension of being a woman. And in this case, it translated into a certain kind of sex panic around sexual violence. That sexual violence was the primary form of harm, gendered harm, and therefore that is the only thing we should tackle. And the mode of tackling that then became this global interventionist project, because sexual harm usually was constructed as happening elsewhere, happening in less, I use developed within quotes, in less developed locations. And this was on account of the backwardness of the very specific cultures. So it became a project of rescue the global South woman from her fundamentally oppressive patriarchal culture, because sexual violence is the primary mode of violence. And the only way to achieve this is by tying it to the statist project. So interventions were facilitated through this notion of sexual violence. And rather than the earlier iteration of a critical framework, let's say the anti-war project, anti-war feminist project's goal was that war cannot be the obvious solution to anything. The thrust completely shifted to war is inevitable, but let's focus on minimizing sexual violence. So there are many similar appropriations and co-options of the larger feminist project that was critical and structural in nature to these very narrow definitions of what is it that feminism can do and should do. And it kept getting, bracketed into these very, very narrow silos of operation. And the larger idea of other modes of universalization, different world making potential, all of this has been subsumed or marginalized.
Thank you for that answer. My next question would be with regard to our group, because this interest group is about teaching international law. So when it comes to research, we have a lot of freedom, I would say, that we can fix our research agenda, we can fix how we go about it. But when it comes to teaching, maybe Jindal is an exception because, as I understand it, Jindal is a big law school. You have large number of academics, and you may enjoy quite a bit of liberty. I don't know about much about Jindal's teaching, but I know about Jindal's research. So I was wondering that when it comes to teaching, what role can we have as educators or as teachers to sort of present these strands that are not often present in the mainstream international law discourse? Thank you.
This is a really great question, and this is, one I think about a lot. While all of us teach and we put a lot of effort into teaching, we don't talk about teaching often enough, and certainly not together. And particularly in international law, because I've worked with a lot of international law teachers and looked at what goes on as teaching of international law. And what has, one of the things that I've noticed is we are woefully inadequate when it comes to getting together and talking about teaching. So one useful thing to do would be to get together as teachers of international law in specific locations, understand very clear structural limitations that we may have. In some cases, it would be something as simple as lack of resource. In other cases, it would be serious institutional constraints depending on the kind of regime you're in, and so on and so forth. And then chat about how some of these ideas can make their way into the teaching structure. There are, of course, curriculums we can share and discuss, and that's a small step to take. But I think the more substantive thing to do is meet together as teachers, discuss our different teaching philosophies and the challenges of teaching international law, which is why I was articulating my conceptual difficulties earlier. So an intellectual engagement of why should we teach this? What does it aim to foreground? What does it hope to displace? Are we able to teach it depending on our geography, on our political positions, on our location, so on and so forth, as a lot of international law teachers who are not necessarily located in the global north will understand the import of what that means. So my sense is, I think Professor Angie already began the conversation with Trilla, getting a group of international law teachers in Asia together. But this is taking that further and talking about specific modes and components of teaching that look to disrupt and that are not easy to do. So I'm of the opinion that we should all get together as teachers and really sit and unpack some of the content that we use as international law teaching and see how we can help each other, especially where there are serious structural challenges. We are doing some versions of that in India. We're actually hoping to get together as teachers of international law and see if we are able to help colleagues who are in institutions that may not, as you said, allow for as much mobility and freedom as Jindal does. But it's a start. We'll see where that goes.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Swati Singh Parmar. She has actually commended your presentation. She has started with the words that it is an excellent presentation. And before I put her question to you, let me tell you and the colleagues who are here today that in our interest group, we are also trying to have a mechanism for course outline sharing. So if any one of you are interested, you could email us. We would try to post your course outlines on the ASIL website. As the ASIL colleagues have promised us that they will take this initiative. We are trying to get hold of as many course outlines as we can. So thank you for that. Now, let me go back to Swati's questions. She is asking two questions. The first one is, there are scholarly texts that call, quote unquote, state as a colonial construct. State also is a patriarchal construct centered in concepts of power, authority, etc. There is commonality of critique there. How do you see state as 12 feminism view? And her second question is, practically, apart from the didactic discomfort you talked about, there is love-hate relationship with TWAIL in states like India and contempt for subjects like feminism. Is there any way to deal with such issues? Thank you.
This is a great question, and I must at this juncture point out that Swati is a colleague whose work I look up to, and we've worked together on some of these ideas, especially about teaching of international law and in India. I'll try and answer this as best as I can. So the first part of the question, the TWAIL feminist interrogation of the state, is also something I cover in the paper, which is the various way in which TWAIL feminism foregrounds the maleness of the state visually, structurally, one by understanding how women's bodies not only serve as sites of reproductive control or as sites of generating certain kind of social reproduction, but how in some instances, particularly in the life cycle of indigenous women, it also becomes a metaphor for other forms of governmentality to exist. So unpacking the state through the violence that is committed onto the bodies of indigenous women, indigenous modes of lifestyle, is a way in which TWAIL feminism not only interrogates the coloniality, but also the fundamentally patriarchal construct of post-colonial states, which is also where Mahashweta Devi's piece, which I was referring to earlier, comes in handy, because that play is a searing account not only of how the female body serves as a site of violence, allowing this nature of state to be exposed very, very well, but also how ideas of theory and practice contribute to this confounding understand of state as colonial, but not necessarily state as male. In other words, I think it's easier for people to understand coloniality in some instances because there's the history and legacy. But like you said, feminisms done in particular location tends to dislodge certain cultural status quo, and that is partly why I think there's such dislike or resistance towards doing something like that. One way to address it, I think, is to foreground it the way I was in the beginning of the presentation, which is that it's not a perspective that only women should be interested in because it talks about women's problem. It's a vantage that has world-making potential. In other words, if this is a perspective that pertains to women, so are the others. Everything is a perspective. And decentering the ones that pose as universal and then centering the ones that have always known that they were marginal from the beginning is of interest to everybody. So I think it is sort of making the TWAIL feminist discourse sellable as that it has something in it for everybody. It's not just things that affect women from marginalized position. It has the potential to make a better world because the one that we live in is not particularly good, other than catering to a certain group of people. So I think that's one way to make this more palatable. But as you know, this is not an easy thing to do. There are other impulses that typically tend to operate against any kind of feminist project in international law. Also, the question of expertise, the question of authority, the question of treating it as serious knowledge, because you're also asking people to let go of what they cognitively construct as knowledge, as expertise, as useful, and then think of things differently. I don't know if that answers Swati's questions, but that's sort of where I'm at with this.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. Now, I would like to ask you on sort of a related question that when we talk about feminist approach to international law, that in itself, in my view, is a challenge because it is not something that is too often discussed in the mainstream international law academia. So when it comes to presenting 12 feminism or global South womanhood, as you have written in your paper, what other special challenges do you encounter as a 12 feminist, then let's say just a feminist scholar writing on global North feminist issues? Could you shed some light on that?
This is such a, again, it's a brilliant question and it's a very difficult one. There are so many challenges. First, you're working with two critical disciplines that constantly have to defend themselves against charges of being excessively radical, being vacuous, not offering anything useful, too personal. These are all emotions, etc., etc. So I think the demand of empiricism from both TWAIL and feminism is the two combined together. And it completely turns the gaze away from where we should actually be demanding empiricism from, which is mainstream international law. That's one substantive challenge. You're constantly always on the back foot. Two, I think, which is exactly what I mean by being defined against. You spend so much time defining yourself against something and defending yourself in that framework that the prescriptive project remains marginalized. So one has limited energy to do this sort of work. If you spend most of your time justifying why you're doing what you're doing, the prescriptive things will invariably end up taking a backseat. So that's also something that happens. The third thing is, I think, sometimes, and this is where the identity shift matters, sometimes I'm expected to speak with authority on matters that I necessarily may not have any authority on. And you end up carrying this mantle of global South representativeness, which you A, don't want to carry, B, you are not often qualified to do, other than the fact that it's a strand of research that you work on. So there are all of these constructs and impositions on you as a scholar inhabiting a particular identity that I think takes away from the substantive, critical thrust of what we do. So mostly it's just constantly justifying, why is this important? Why is this knowledge? Why should people learn this? And then dealing with the backlash that usually comes when you ask people to reorient their cognition. Not just this is new content, please engage with it, but change the way you look at knowledge. So there's a lot of backlash against that. But yeah, these are the three things I could think of.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank God that many of us who do not sort of teach these kind of courses, we don't have to confront these challenges. With that note, thank you so much once again for your excellent presentation and for all your answers. And I hope that this is just the beginning of the dialogue. It will go on. And I look forward to receiving the course outlines from the colleagues who are here today. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me and letting me have this conversation. This was extremely pleasurable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.